Hi, Kenneth.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I am great. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Kenneth Folk. You are a pretty well-known meditation teacher. Now, as regular viewers and listeners know, I'm very interested in meditation, Buddhist philosophy, and every once in a while I do have a well-known meditation teacher on. And then something I've done a couple of times is have someone on who says that they have attained enlightenment or awakening. We had Daniel Ingram on, whom I think you know. And I think you fall in that category of someone who says, why be modest?
Yeah. Yeah. My thing is, I like to say awakening is real. It's a thing. And the reason I know that is because it happened to me. And then here's how, for those who are interested.
Okay. Well, I want you to explain all that to us and explain what it's like to be awakened, because I'm afraid I don't know from firsthand experience. But before we get to that, I wanted to quote you something about you from Wired magazine. A couple of years ago, there was a piece in Wired about how meditation was catching on in Silicon Valley, a few years ago, I guess. And I think at that point you were based out in San Francisco. And at the bottom of the piece, or somewhere in the piece, there was a list of, 5 or 6 notable people in these circles. And you were quoted and really discussed substantially in the piece itself. But in that little series of one-sentence profiles, what it said about you was, he popularized the notion of open source enlightenment, winning adherents in Silicon Valley, and plenty of eye rolls from the American Buddhist establishment. Can you unpack that a little for us? For starters, what is open source enlightenment? Is it...
That's the very idea that it is attainable and accessible to normal people, which will entail defining awakening in a particular way, which we will. As far as the eye rolls, I think that makes sense. That's pretty predictable because the way Buddhism is often taught, enlightenment, well, the Buddha was enlightened, and maybe a few people living in caves in Asia, but normal people living in New York, forget about it.
Okay, but you're saying that's wrong. Normal people living in New York can be enlightened. I mean, you're certainly right that in kind of mainstream American Buddhist circles, it's not common for someone to claim to have attained enlightenment. It's kind of frowned on, I guess. And even people of really considerable meditative attainment, or people who seem to have that and are thought to have that, are generally reluctant to claim enlightenment. But you're saying it's more available to more of us than we realize.
Yes, and I think if it is going to be realized by more of us, we would have to dispense with the taboo. Another frame for this is to notice that enlightenment is normally thought of as something, it's pretty binary. You either are enlightened or you're not. And I like to make physical fitness parallels. I think that there's a great parallel to be made here. If I said to you, physical fitness is binary, you're either Hercules or you're not, well, okay, but nobody's Hercules. There actually never was such a person. Similarly, if we're going to get really rigorous in the definition of enlightenment, you behave meticulously and everyone likes you and you wear flowing white clothes and you smell fragrant, nobody is or ever was if we go far enough with this, because we're going to get into moral purity and so on. So what if that's just one way of telling stories and doesn't reflect what happens to real people? I say what happens to real people is there is some kind of a continuum of development, and people can be more and more awakened, and there's probably some kind of a bell curve where in the fat part of the bell curve is where most people are going to end up, and we're going to have some outlying stars and some outlying laggards. But if there is something analogous to physical fitness, as I say, and we call it something, let's call it contemplative fitness, now everything looks different. Now we can do targeted exercises to work toward it. We can set achievable goals and so on.
Okay. Well, I think one reason enlightenment is thought of as kind of a binary thing is that, I mean, isn't the way it's treated in ancient texts somewhat consistent with a binary conception of it in some respects? I mean, it is thought to be something that leads, well, that is tantamount to having attained nirvana, which is like a major, major, major thing. And it's also equated with liberation from suffering. And liberation is a binary word, right? Either you're in prison or you're out of prison. You don't just stand there at the doorway. I mean, you know, true liberation from suffering would be, you know, I think you'd know when you were there, right? It's not like there's a continuum of, you see what I mean? I guess my question is, are you arguing that actually a careful reading of Buddhist texts shows you to be right about this and shows this physical fitness metaphor to be apt, or are you kind of redefining awakening and enlightenment?
That's a good point. The first thing I would probably say is that I would be willing to toss out the Buddhist texts if we find that there's something in our own experience that's valuable. Now, as it happens, I can probably make a reasonable case that we can read the text in a way that supports my thesis. But really, the only reason I care about the text is to support my thesis. And so in my own experience and in my experience working with other people and talking with other people who do these kinds of contemplative fitness practices, if you will, there is a continuum. So yes, it's often talked about in a binary way, and I don't think that's the best way to talk about it.
Okay. So let me, so it's possible that I could be like less awakened than you are, but still qualify as awakened or enlightened.
Yeah, and it's always going to be a gray area, because what would be the metric for success anyway? Would it be that, I don't know, that I claim to be in tune with something you're not, and how will we measure it? Mm-hmm. Or is it that I can sit quietly for 2 hours and you can only sit for 1? None of that really hangs together for me. And to the extent that we're talking about liberation from what? Suffering, how are we going to define that? So if we're going to be more realistic about it, we're doing this to feel better, frankly. Some purists will say modern ideas of enlightenment are nothing but rehashed self-help program, and there can be some validity to that critique. But what if that is all it is? Would that really be so bad? If we could actually have better lives as a result of doing these practices, I think a lot of people would sign up for that. And I think that is where it goes.
Well, it wouldn't be so bad. I'm in favor of successful self-help, but a lot of people think of Buddhism as having more dimensions than that, and these dimensions having been reflected in the text. I mean, for what that's worth. I mean, so some of the dimensions would be that enlightenment. First of all, it's literal. You're actually seeing reality more clearly. You're piercing a veil of delusion. So you don't. It's not just that you feel better. That actually coincides with seeing reality more acutely. And then most people would say there's a moral dimension as well. Certainly, the Buddhist texts include a lot of moral, a lot about that, and I think a lot of people say these are the kinds of things that distinguish this from run-of-the-mill self-help. It's not just you becoming happier. It's you becoming happier by aligning yourself with a literally true vision of the world and aligning yourself with moral truth or right conduct or something.
Yeah, I think that is often what's meant by it. Let's talk about the truth, the true with a capital T. That I find that a difficult idea. I don't know how we would know that if we stumbled upon it. I mean, what we know is our own experience, and we can be pretty sure about our own experience, but that's frankly all I'm sure about. The only thing I would assert is this seems to be happening.
Right,
so I'm not
but
going
surely
to say
you'd agree that, maybe you wouldn't, that the word enlightenment actually traditionally is meant literally. The Buddha was talking about seeing things more clearly. He wasn't being a complete relativist about this.
Well,
I mean, if you accept what is attributed to the Buddha in the text, which is a whole other question, right?
seeing things more clearly, yes, and actually that is one of the metrics for success. I think that's one of the fundamental skills that comes together to make us enlightened or awakened.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't well, just to be clear on this one point, you would say there are a lot of people who aren't enlightened. You're not just saying, hey, you're right there and you don't know it. You're not redefining enlightenment that broadly, or you're not conceiving it that broadly. You're saying a lot of people aren't enlightened. You're saying you are. I'm pretty sure I'm not by even a liberal definition. So why don't you tell us kind of what it's like to be you? I mean, by virtue of the fact that you're enlightened, I think the premise is there's something about what it's like to be you that's desirable, and that some people don't have. I think I don't have it. What is it? What is it like to be you?
In a word, I would say my experience of myself in the world feels like weather. Weather is happening. There isn't anybody doing it. One of the aspects of weather, in this case, is the sense, the occasional momentary sense that this is happening to me, and that's also part of weather. So that doesn't get privileged as something special that gets to stand outside of everything else and say, I'm the center of this.
So you don't take things personally in a certain sense, I mean, in a broad sense.
Yes, and just to parse a little bit, I don't even take it personally that I take it personally. So we're really going meta on this. In fact, that's the game, actually, is going meta at each point. There's this process of development which can be framed as psychological development or ego development as well. And basically, you keep finding an umbrella lens, as I think of it, that will contextualize a dilemma.
That will contextualize a dilemma. Can you give us an example?
Yes. So let's say, for example, I am either right wing or left wing politically, and if I'm right wing, I value protecting my things and making sure that other people don't take them from me. And if I'm left wing, I value everybody getting enough to eat, and more of an emphasis on the collective, and our tendency is to dig in our heels. I'm either right wing or I'm left wing, but it's also possible to step into the next rung and say, well, actually, I do like protecting my stuff, and I kind of do like being around people that are like me. I'm not comfortable around a bunch of weirdos. And on the left wing side, I very much would like to see everybody get enough to eat, and I don't mind universal health care. That sounds trivial when I say it, but it's surprising how often we dig in and we suffer cognitive dissonance when we find ourselves relating to the other side of one of these dichotomies.
So you're saying you do not identify with labels? That's part of this?
I suppose that's part of it, or to the extent that I identify with labels, I attempt to access a lens that will contextualize the binary.
Okay, I want to get back to this lens metaphor, but let's return to something pretty concrete and elementary, like, say, anxiety. I think I know how most people experience anxiety. I think I know how I usually experience it. Is there something different about the way you experience anxiety that would be appealing to me?
I think so. Now, I don't know, of course, how you or other people experience anxiety, but I do know how I experience it now and how I have experienced it at various times throughout my life. The way I experience it now, and I do experience anxiety, is mainly as body sensation. I'm not taking my thoughts about it as seriously as I once did, and and this is in keeping with the physical or the contemplative fitness idea, I have some go-to moves. I have some skills to be able to get a break. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I can access a mode of operation of the mind where there's so little meaning making, there isn't even language going on. So that's great for anxiety, because you can't remember who you are and you can't remember what your problem was supposed to be.
There are other ways to do that, but okay. So you view the anxiety objectively in a certain sense. You don't own it. I mean, you might have. I mean, physiologically, what's going on in me when I feel anxiety might be going on. You feel it in a certain sense, but because you don't own it and relate to it personally, it loses its unpleasantness.
Yes, it helps a lot. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. In the binary idea, the Hercules version of enlightenment, you wouldn't have anxiety at all. Well, I haven't actually ever met anyone like that, so I don't believe in Hercules. But it certainly does get a lot better. You get more coping mechanisms, and you still have good days and bad days. And I play around with this idea of meta-okayness. So it might really suck today, but I can be meta-okay about that to some extent. I can be somewhat okay that it isn't okay.
Mm-hmm. So, I think there are a lot, when you describe it that way, I think there are a lot of people that I've met who would say, that's more or less the way I am. In other words, people who meditate a lot. And they say, that's more or less the way I am. I just don't call it enlightenment, precisely because I have thought of enlightenment as being this ultimate state where you really don't suffer at all. That's what liberation from suffering would seem to mean. So yeah, if this trick with anxiety and other unpleasant things worked like 100% of the time, then maybe I'd call myself enlightened, but I just don't. So in other words, I think the dispute between you and them is almost semantic, right?
Yes.
It is.
Yep.
So they're saying you shouldn't call yourself enlightened just because you're using the word in a way that is not the way people use it.
Well, I'm certainly using it in a way that's not the way they use it. But I can read early Buddhist texts and say I relate very much to what they're describing. Mm-hmm. If I just take away some of the hyperbole. I mean, it seems to me there's this kind of ongoing, can you top this storytelling that accretes throughout the centuries.
Mm-hmm. I see. And of course, we don't have a very clear idea of which part of the, what was said when. Really, I mean, the dating of the text is not a foolproof thing. Okay, so now so far it's sounded to people probably like. Very successful self-help. If most of the time you have anxiety or fear or sadness or something, you have a way of dealing with it. That's very successful self-help. But of course, Buddhism does relate that to claims about the actual nature of reality. For example, the idea of, in radical-sounding claims like not self, like the idea that the self, as we normally conceive ourselves, is an illusion, and the idea that we tend to view things as being in a certain sense more substantial than they are, having more in the way of essence than they do. This is called the doctrine of emptiness, and the idea is that that overcoming suffering involves apprehending these truths. Now, you've already suggested one way that not self could enter in. You've said you kind of don't own, you recognize that the anxiety is not inherently a part of some self thing that you are alleged to be, right? Mm-hmm. But not self is sometimes described by meditators as being more an experience that's more dramatic than just that, than just seeing some anxiety and going, no thanks, I think I'll pass. Have you also had that experience? The what would be called the deeper kind of not self experience?
Yes, I've had many experiences, but I really what I think you're talking about is, do I generally experience not self, and that one's easy Yeah. so, uh, so we should probably unpack not self a little bit. We could say that properly understood, not self asserts there simply isn't a self. Um, it's not clear to me that the Buddha said that in the early text. I think what he
Right.
was saying, basically, he was avoiding ontological claims, and he was saying, for example, a kind of stock response would be, the Tathagata has expressed no opinion on the matter. But he would say, if you look
Tathagata
for
meaning the
the
Buddha in that
Tathagata
context,
meaning
yeah.
the Buddha, yes, sorry, and but what he would say is, if you look for a self, I reckon you won't find it. So look for yourself and see. This is my experience. If you'll forgive the use of the word my, when I look in here for a self, there doesn't seem to be one. And now it's not that I ever find a definitive no self any more than I definitively find that there is not a mouse in the house. But if I look every day for the mouse and I never find it, I can start behaving as though there's no mouse.
Okay. Um, but is it? I mean, not many of us spend much time looking for a self. It's true that, if I did, I might go, I don't really see exactly, I can't really locate the thing. And philosophers, I think William James wrote about this, did that as an exercise. On the other hand, you don't do that many times during the day. So if that's all you meant by not self, that wouldn't, it might not seem like a very relevant thing to a lot of people, because they'd be like, well, I'm not going around looking for it anyway. Maybe you're right, I wouldn't find it if I looked, but I'm not going around looking for it. But I think you'd say, when you say you experience not self all the time, that it actually manifests itself, this not experiencing the self, many times a day in some way that's different than my experience might be, right? I mean, we used anxiety as an example, but are there different and deeper examples of how your experience is actually different because of you're not seeing a self?
Well, I won't compare my experience to yours because I don't know about yours. But but my experience has changed in that not believing in the solidity or the existence of myself turns out to be beneficial all day long. It seems to be a wonderful thing. It doesn't protect against suffering, but it's, from the point of view from where I sit now, it's vastly superior to where it was before. I want to tell you something odd, some kind of oddball thing that's been going on here, just because I think it will somehow be relevant. I think most of us have self-talk, so we coach ourselves, we rehearse, we tell ourselves stories, and there's an implied I with all of that. Something odd happened to me within the last year. A different kind of self-talk started emerging and has continued to happen alongside the regular self-talk, and this one is the impersonal third person. So what will happen is the self-talk will say, it doesn't well, it could be anything. It's looking out the window. It's shaving. It doesn't mind if I start reflecting on philosophy. It doesn't mind that it's going to die. Just.
By the way, is that true? You don't fear death at all?
No, I fear prolonged discomfort. But
well, that's actually what I've always said. But so maybe I am enlightened. But anyway, go ahead. So you've got this kind of third person narrative going on now. Okay, so go ahead. You were going to say more about that?
Yeah. I'm just mentioning it because it's. I think it's weird even to me, and I haven't heard other people say that. Now that's also happening with an overall diminution of self-talk. So there's much more spontaneously occurring quiet in the mind, and just accessing a mode of operation of the mind that doesn't use language. And that turns out to be really beautiful.
Okay.
I call this reclaiming my inner dog.
Your inner dog, which is to say just your kind of absorption, your unselfconscious absorption.
Yeah, unselfconscious absorption, or just sensory input is coming in, but language isn't. Language hasn't come online. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine what it might be like to be a dog. They don't even know their own name. They're conditioned to respond to a sound, presumably. They don't know who they are, and they don't have an idea of time. They can't place themselves on a narrative timeline. So they're just in it. And it's when we access this, and we can, it's a beautiful foil for our other language mode of operation, which is also valuable. I'm not denigrating that.
Now, I think we need to distinguish between two kinds of self-talk. So, I think a kind we naturally engage in is, I'm late for that appointment. I gotta get there. I shouldn't have said that. That guy was a jerk to me. There's a lot of self-referential narration of our own life, but there's a kind of what some people might think of as self-talk that's actually encouraged as part of the practice that is different and that is closer to your third-person version, and that's this business of noting, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you would say this is actually an important part of getting to enlightenment or even being enlightened, but it's a slightly different thing where you take things you normally wouldn't consciously make a note to yourself about, like I am drinking the water, and you actually, this is encouraged at some kinds of meditation retreats and so on, and you actually make a note of everything you're doing. Now, these tend to be not like emotionally invested the way more common kind of self-talk is, right? Like, I'm late, makes me anxious. That guy was mean to me. I'm, blah, blah, blah. So it's more detached by its nature, I guess. And in that sense, just making it explicitly third person might not seem that big a leap, right? I mean,
yes.
So talk a little about the role of noting and just being aware of what you're doing and what role that plays in your view in getting enlightened, being enlightened, whatever.
I think it's a fantastic tool. It's one of the best. It gives you a feedback loop because you can hear yourself saying it either subvocally or out loud. I do a lot of it aloud, and I teach it that way.
So you have meditators actually say, "I feel itching,"
yes,
or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, the phrase that I like best is "there is." Because
there is itching, there is
makes it
right.
Third party. It makes it into a noun, and it makes it impersonal. There is seeing, there is coolness, there is thinking, there is excitement, there's interest, there's aching, and so on. It's the first thing I teach anybody, and I will submit that you don't ever outgrow that. That we can continue to do that through a lifetime and benefit from it, just as we would continue to do biceps curls if we wanted to keep our biceps in shape.
Okay. Let me get back to that thing you said about your death, you fear prolonged suffering. Of course, a conventional retort would be, well, if you were really enlightened, you wouldn't have to feel long-term suffering because you could be in intensive care forever and you would know how to take the suffering out of it. Right.
Yeah, I mean, anyone could assert anything. I never met that person.
Well, right. So maybe enlightenment is unattainable except by the, once every 2 millennia person.
Possibly. I mean, it certainly is possible. I even heard about some woman who suffered maybe a stroke to a particular part of her brain and lost her ability to feel fear. So she doesn't fear anything at all. Mm-hmm. Now, she struggles with that. This actually makes her life very difficult, by all accounts. So I'm not sure that that's anything we should even aspire to.
Yeah. Of course, and we should say that even many and maybe most conventional Buddhist teachers and monks and so on would say there have been enlightened people since the Buddha and would point to some who are thought to have attained this status. So in a way, maybe what you're saying is even these rare individuals who are called enlightened surely didn't overcome suffering every moment of their life, right?
I believe that's correct, yeah, in the way that I would define suffering.
Okay. Now, what about, I alluded to the role of this dimension of morality, which is very explicit in a lot of the Buddhist texts. I mean, if you look at the Eightfold Path, there's a lot of like moral prescription. Some of it sounds almost like the Ten Commandments, about how you should speak and what kind of value should be embodied in the vocation you choose and so on. And then beyond that, there is this idea that that moving toward enlightenment, leave aside your compliance with moral prescriptions, moving toward enlightenment kind of naturally makes it easier to be a good person, maybe largely because you're not attached to the self the way you might have previously been. But in any event, do you consider kind of moral progress one of the hallmarks of enlightenment? I mean, if someone is a horrible person, can somebody be a horrible person and be enlightened by your definition? Assuming we would agree on what a horrible person is. Let's say they murder people, innocent people.
Well, I like the way you said, assuming we agree on what a horrible person is. That's really important because there are different value systems in different cultures and among different people. So we have to line up on that. So we're talking about murdering innocent people. Could an enlightened person murder innocent people?
Well, would you still call them enlightened? Is
Okay, I would say that I have to think morality is pretty orthogonal to enlightenment as I define it. I can imagine being enlightened as I define it and doing all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons. I don't think morality is the essence of it. However, I can also see a kind of a loose correlation. As our lenses stack up and encompass one another, if I can see that you are as important as me, I'm less likely to hurt you. So it does seem to move in that direction. It does seem to move toward less harming.
Okay, have you noticed that in your own life? Do you think you do less harm to other people, inflict less suffering than you did before you were enlightened?
Yes, certainly. And I even remember have been certain really stark examples of that, a kind of punctuated equilibrium as I look at the whole process. I remember a time having a really big, grandiose spiritual opening when I was younger, and the very next day, I had completely changed my behavior to the point where...
Was this the LSD trip?
That was the LSD trip, right. So,
and the change in behavior was that you were no longer a cocaine addict, as I understand the story?
That was yes, that was a stark change, but that isn't the one I was thinking of, because that's not morality by my way of thinking. It doesn't bear on morality. But I would go to Del Taco, which is a taco chain in Southern California, and every once in a while the people at the window would forget to take the money. And normally, you just chuckle and drive away fast. Yeah. But after that, in the next week, it happened, and I walked in and I handed the money over, and just happened to be the manager that I gave the money to, and I explained it, and he kind of looked at me funny, and as I was walking away, I heard him say, "What a jerk."
Really?
I thought it was kind of cute. To him, anybody who would actually go to all the trouble to walk back there and give the $1.50 was a jerk. But to me, it was reflecting my newfound understanding that those people matter too.
Okay. Now, as long as we're talking LSD. As I understand it, so you had been a cocaine addict, you were out of cocaine, so naturally you take LSD instead. You have an amazing trip. After that, you no longer have any yearning for cocaine, apparently. Cured the addiction, but moreover, experiences you had in the trip sent you on a search. I guess you actually probably went to Asia, who knows, but you did the equivalent, I'm sure, looking for the non-pharmaceutical version of what you'd done. What was it about the experience itself that instilled that kind of ambition in you? What was it you wanted to replicate, or at least you thought worthy of exploring?
Well, there are a couple of components. One is just the amazing subjective feeling of feeling unified with the universe. Another, I would imagine, is that something changed in my nervous system. Some neurons may have locked up that day that hadn't, or connected that day that hadn't before. And so I actually was different after that.
Okay. And do you still feel more unity? Is part of awakening to you feeling more unity with other people, other forms of life than you did before?
Surprisingly, no. In fact, that self-validating experience of believing in my heart of hearts that I understood the very nature of reality with a capital R, through the decades of practice, that actually faded. And I won't make any claims about the nature of reality. I'll just say that I had an experience where the self-validation slider was pegged. However, as far as the unity business, unity isn't the word I would describe, used to describe it. Stuff is happening. It's in a sense not. There isn't separation in some sense. I mean, it's all happening. It's all weather. But the idea that there's some cosmic unity, which is the real thing that we're normally missing, that we can tune into, I don't buy it.
That is a report some people give, though, who follow the meditative path pretty far, right? There's some universal field of consciousness, and they feel that rather than them being a self, they are just a kind of a point of access to the field, and the field is the thing or something. But
yes. So that is an experience that I'm familiar with, and there was a period of several years where I did believe that was kind of the base state that we could get to. I no longer see it that way. I see that as the experience of that as an experience, a mental construct. I can't say that's reality with a capital R. And by the way, I still have access to it. It's awesome, and
You mean you can feel that way when you want to feel that way?
Yeah, which I think is very interesting and telling. It's very telling in itself. The fact that I don't spend every waking hour trying to feel that way might say something.
What do you think it says?
It says if it were really that good, I wouldn't have given up. I wouldn't have. It wouldn't have become old hat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you don't feel like unity with other people, but does whatever your perceptions are about other people, do they lead to the kind of what you might call the moral equivalent of feeling unity with them? In other words, when you would think that people who feel unity with other people wouldn't go around hurting them, trying to cheat them, and so on, and that would be kind of natural. They wouldn't have to work at it because they feel unified with them. They feel that person is them in a sense. Mm-hmm. And you do get reports like this. Does your view of the rest of humanity and the rest of life lead to that kind of? I mean, we've talked about this a little. You gave the money back to the guy at Del Taco, but is this, would you say, kind of a significant and persistent feature of your behavior?
it's something that I relate to. It's one of the perspectives that naturally comes online throughout my day. But another perspective that can come online, which is just seeing it all as weather, it doesn't. From that point of view, there isn't any sense of this one or that one should live or die. It's so what, within the larger system, that's not much of an issue.
Now, critics might call that apathy or nihilism or something.
Sure, you could call it that. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of this
you're a nihilist.
Nihilism is a perspective that I can relate to, and I could also take the other side of it.
I guess any good nihilist should be able to do that, maybe. But nihilism, in this sense, being the idea that does that mean you don't see inherent value in things? You don't see inherent values, or what?
Right. I don't see inherent values. I think the value is pretty arbitrary. I think you and I would probably have some values that we would agree on, and ideally, I think we would know that they are values, as opposed to something baked into the fabric of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly an issue, a question, a much discussed question. So some people may be finding this kind of unappealing once you start talking about nihilism and apathy and things. And well, for starters, why shouldn't they?
I don't think that they shouldn't. I remember my primary Buddhist teacher was an American man named Bill Hamilton, and he used to say the Buddhists are their own worst PR people.
Meaning?
You talk about the early Buddhists would talk about getting off the wheel of death and rebirth, and the way that they talk about it is nibbana, and nibbana isn't a cosmic bliss out as they describe it. It's just lights out. It's turn off the switch. That's how you get out of the wheel of death and rebirth. So my teacher Bill would also say the Theravada Buddhists, the early Buddhists, were a cosmic suicide club.
Mm-hmm. And Nibbana is the Pali word for the more commonly used word nirvana.
Correct. That's exactly right.
And of course, there are debates over what exactly it meant, whether it just meant lights out, or whether, while you are living and have attained nirvana, whether it's this totally mind-blowing, amazing thing. But that brings us back to where we were at the beginning of the conversation. So let's not do that. What about what about people who say this doesn't sound appealing because I don't want to see the world as weather? Leave aside the moral questions, the values question, the nihilism. People who say, I don't want to see just viewing everything as weather, viewing things that objectively seems to take kind of the juice out of life. I like some of my feelings, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what do you have to say to them?
The good news, I suppose, is that you don't necessarily lose access to developmental stages that you have gone beyond. So you can still watch a movie and become totally absorbed in it when that's appropriate. I would also say I don't think there's any reason to believe that everybody has to want to become enlightened. I mean, to use maybe a trivial example, and maybe even a disrespectful example, although I don't mean it that way. When I was a child, being an adult didn't look very appealing to me. In fact, I was pretty sure it was a bad deal.
And I think I was right, but go ahead.
You might have been right. And so this is another point. It's not necessarily better from the point of view of the person to develop further. Higher levels of ego development aren't necessarily more pleasing to that person, but it does happen. And one thing that's particularly painful is when we're, I think, ripe for the next stage and we drag our feet.
Mm-hmm. But would you say when you're just viewing when life is just weather, that's not a totally neutral state, right? I mean, is there something beautiful about that, or is there something good in any sense about that?
there's something gratifying about it in the sense that there isn't so much of you to be concerned about it. It really takes the sting out of, on a bad day, when I do feel anxious or afraid or despairing, the weather perspective can really take the sting out of that.
Okay. I said I'd get back to this lens metaphor. You're talking about using lenses. What do you mean by that?
Using lenses is fundamental to my way of teaching and my way of seeing all of this. It seems to me that in any given moment we're seeing through some kind of a lens. The way we're understanding what's going on is mediated through some meaning-making structure. And every lens both obscures and reveals. So there isn't any right lens that's going to let you see very simultaneously very zoomed out and very zoomed in. Mm-hmm. By accessing lots of different lenses, one thing that happens is we tend to not get so stuck in any. And that, practically speaking, is really beneficial because we sometimes get stuck in really painful ones. And if we see, well, I seem to remember yesterday I was looking at the same set of information from a very different point of view, and I wasn't suffering as much. And then take it a step further, maybe I could even access that point of view. And so once you have dozens of lenses that you could bring online, in a very mechanistic way, you can even just bring a new lens online as an intervention, as a crisis intervention.
Do you remember what kind of information this was that you were viewing from a different perspective?
Well, let's see. Let's say it's a relationship thing. I said something to my wife that I feel terrible about.
So you do feel terrible about it?
Yes.
Okay. Some people would say, good, glad to hear that. Some people listening to this might say, okay, good. We were worried you wouldn't feel terrible about saying bad things. But for a while you felt terrible about it, and then you did a lens shift?
Yeah, which might happen spontaneously and often does, or you might just conjure up another lens. You might say, I'm tired of feeling terrible. How about if I do weather for a while? Or how about if I do dog for a while?
So you can just literally zoom out, so to speak, like you're really focused on this unpleasant thing, and then you go for this kind of more objective 360 view where it's just one of many things happening, and it's not happening to you. You can kind of do that at will.
Yes, and here again we have the contemplative fitness idea parallel to physical fitness, because you gain a skill set and you can call up your skills as necessary. Now, in a sense, that's the most trivial, mundane use of training the mind, but it's incredibly useful, practically speaking. And since it's not the only thing that happens, we can let it be.
Now, two things people might say in response to that. One is, if you're so enlightened, why did you say something terrible to your wife? A. B, isn't it bad? Isn't there a downside to not continuing to feel terrible about something? I mean, sometimes when I feel, if I say something to my wife that I regret and I feel bad about it, that leads me to go apologize. Now, as she can attest, that doesn't happen very often, but it's happened. Or it leads me to make amends in some other way, right? So it kind of leads to what you could call a good behavior, just in the sense that it reduces the amount of suffering in the world by doing something to her that helps things. So what I mean, is there? Well, there are two questions there. First, if you're so enlightened, why did you say something mean to your wife? Secondly, isn't there something good about you feeling bad until you make amends?
As to the first one, if I'm so enlightened, how come I keep saying bad things to my wife? I'm not that enlightened. I mean, as you know, I don't even think that's on the table. I don't see any of us ever getting to the point where we're not going to say something that's going to offend someone, including our loved ones. So it's basically a non-issue. Yeah, I'm going to make mistakes, and I would like to be able to deal with it as well as I can. The second part Interestingly, the Buddhists talked a lot about this moral shame and moral dread. It's considered a good thing, as you point out, and for the same reasons. If I don't feel moral dread, I might as well be a axe murderer. If I don't feel moral shame, then the fact that I did something unfortunate and don't feel bad about it, then I'm that much more likely to do it again.
Okay. So I've heard you talk about, this is kind of related to, well, it sounds like it's related to lenses. I think it's not the same thing. But talk about how we, people without realizing it, have kind of filters, visual filters, like gels, like, like a transparency of a certain color that's making everything look that color.
Yes.
Right. Now, and is the idea that part of the practice is realizing that that's the case?
Yes, nice. And this ties in with the noting that you brought up earlier, the noting practice where we label phenomena. So if, to use the transparency or the gel as on a theater spotlight, if you put the blue gel in front of the spotlight, everything looks blue on the stage. Well, if I had a blue gel strapped to my face, I wouldn't necessarily know. Everything would look blue, but I would just think everything is blue. And then if you say to me, you have a blue gel strapped to your face, and I say, oh, well, really? And I start looking for it, and then I note that, I label that, oh, blue. By the way, maybe that affects my mood. And so despair. So I'm labeling, I'm noting, I'm noticing what's going on. Unhappiness. I'm not feeling that way right now, so it's hard to note it. But we can see how these things go together. But as soon as I can see it, I can discount it theoretically. I can say, well, maybe I should discount 30% of my despair because I know I'm in a bad mood.
Right.
That's practically speaking a very useful thing. And it goes further, because if I can see what's going on, I can naturally deconstruct everything within my experience to experience. And if I do that, I'm going to find out these Buddhist truths that you alluded to earlier. There's impermanence. This stuff is not sticking around. It's changing. And there is unsatisfactoriness.
Dukkha, sometimes translated as that, sometimes as suffering.
Right, dukkha translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Yeah, now that you mention it. And I know this because I'm seeing what's going on. I'm noticing my own experience in real time and noticing how often I don't like it. And that even when I do like it, it doesn't last. Back to impermanence. And those come together with this idea of not self. If I look for a self, I don't find one. And all this happens very naturally through this exercise of noticing what's going on and answering the question again and again, what?
When you say that, you mean that's the question you're always asking? What is the filter of the moment?
Yeah, exactly. The question, as in, what is the experience, which I sometimes abbreviate to what feeling, what coolness, what hearing, what don't know, what dullness, what interest, what amusement.
Yeah. And so it seems to me, at least part of this gel thing, this transparency thing, is that, people, they're usually in a mood, and they may not realize it. Their perception of the world and their thinking about the world is usually colored and shaped by some affect, by some kind of feeling in the modern sense of the term feeling, not necessarily the original Buddha sense, but and I think, and to me this comes back to the moral question and has moral implications. So I think a common example of this is like, you'll look at someone who is a rival or an enemy, they're a rival for the same mate or the same job or something, and if you look at people who talk about rivals, they will generally say unfavorable things about them, right? And they very often think they're giving you an objective account of the person. And if they're really sufficiently introspective, they will see that actually, whenever they think of that person, they have a certain kind of feeling. And in a subtle way, that feeling shapes their assessment of the person. And they think of it as an honest assessment. It's the assessment they're feeling, but it is actually shaped by the feeling they're having. And these feelings can be so subtle that it really takes, a lot of care to be aware of them. But if you are aware of them, they actually change your perception and cognition, right?
Yes. It makes a really big difference, and I like the way you set it up. So I'm feeling, I'm saying negative things about my rival, and if I am sufficiently introspective, as you say, if I really get into the nitty gritty of it, I'm going to say, what am I feeling? Resentment, anger, hurt, injury, vengefulness, vindictiveness, defensiveness, and so on. That stuff is really hard. It's difficult to see, and I mean that in two senses of see. It's difficult to actually be able to observe it, and it's difficult to accept that that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. But it is what is happening. And if I can talk a little bit, just use this as a springboard to say, what is awakening? What is enlightenment? It's knowing what's happening. It's just toughing. It's toughing it out. It's tough shit meditation. What's actually happening? A lot of stuff that you don't want to have happen. A lot of stuff that you're probably too mature or too hip or too enlightened to happen to you, and it is happening. Mm-hmm. And this is grown-up stuff. And we're awakening to. We're awakening to what's happening, even though we don't like it.
Mm-hmm. And as long as we're on an example that has moral coloring, I feel I should say on behalf of traditional Buddhists everywhere that, when we got into that nihilism question and on the one hand, you can point to ancient Buddhist texts that will seem to kind of affirm that. I mean, the idea of getting so far beyond. You get beyond judgment entirely. You can find that. At the same time, I think, as people would say, there's no doubt that there are explicit values in early Buddhism and in Buddhism as it's unfolded, including the not harming other beings and things like that. So that's a little advertisement on behalf of the Buddhism establishment. You don't object to that?
What you said is true. Some people do believe that.
Well, but I mean, it's there. I mean, there are the moral prescriptions in the text, right?
That's right, and there are all kinds of hagiographic vignettes. This person was so enlightened that he or she didn't do this or that. Exactly, that stuff is in there.
Okay, final question. I alluded to this idea of emptiness. Which, we've talked a lot about not self, but there's also this idea, emphasized more in the Mahayana tradition probably, that the things you see out there, they don't really have the solidity, the essence that we naturally think of them as having. And some people of great meditative attainment say that, they now see the whole world very differently. Things don't look, in a certain sense, as solid or as having quite such distinctive identities, although, of course, they can tell the curtains from the wall. There's something different about it. Is that part of your experience?
Yes. One way of talking about that would be to say that it's perfectly obvious that all of what's being experienced is a mental construct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have kind of a theory. Now, by the way, Bob, I just want to point out, I'm not asserting by that there isn't anything out there and that I'm the solipsistic master of the universe. I'm just saying that my experience of it is entirely a mental construct, presumably informed by sensory input.
Right. For all you know, you could be a brain in a vat.
I could, yes. I love the simulation hypothesis for this reason. It's another lens that illustrates the same idea.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way to disprove that. And for you, does part of this have to do with the feeling thing? In other words, we talked about people having moods. Well, I think more than we realize, we react to specific things affectively sometimes. Like, there's cars we like, cars we don't like. Our home gives us one kind of feeling. Certain kinds of objects, certain kinds of animals. If you took some of the affective response away, I think the sense of their identity would change, right? Do you think that's any of what's going on here?
Yes, and I think your field, or one of your fields of evolutionary psychology, bears on this. We're built. This human organism is built to do what it does.
Mm-hmm.
This particular instantiation of it is going to find a particular kind of car appealing for whatever reason. But this is really baked in here,
Mm-hmm.
and if that can be seen as part of the lens that's operating in the moment, what couldn't we know?
Wait, elaborate on that. What do you mean?
If I can, every once in a while, see the lens that's operating, then I can see beyond it. I don't have to be completely blind. I don't have to be a slave to what this organism is doing. There might be some possibility for some higher functioning to come to the fore if I can see how the lower functioning is coloring the picture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, listen, we've been at this an hour, which is longer than I often go, but it's been engrossing for me. Anything you want to say before we sign off?
It went very quickly, and I've enjoyed it.
Well, so have I, and maybe we'll do it again. Thanks a lot, Kenneth.
Thank you, Bob.